So the question is, what is an allophone? Before I answer that, I'm going to give you an analogy. So let's talk about this concept of a grapheme. A grapheme is just the name that we give to a letter form. So we're talking about orthography here, not necessarily sounds. So if we talk about the kind of underlying message that a letter is trying to convey, in other words, a letter in a word that you would read, not a letter as in like a sound, there are often a lot of different ways to produce the letters. So if you look at the letter Z, some people produce the letter Z like this, and some people do this, and they put a little slash in the middle. If you're like me, you do the little slash, but a lot of people do this one here. They'll do the one without the slash. Either way, though, they're both Z. It doesn't really matter. I mean, if you want to kind of think about it that way, what would be in here is some sort of deep structure representation of the letter Z, but we're going to keep it blank for now. So we need some kind of vocabulary to describe these two levels, the sort of deep structure level, and then also the levels that things are actually realized in when we write down the words. So let's call these allographs. You can remember this part here, the al. It comes from the Greek word allos. It just means other. So think of the English word alias, for instance. Okay? And I can give you another example. Let's talk about the letter I. So the letter I has some variations, and sometimes you might see a variation that you've never heard before, but because you're human and you're used to doing pattern recognition all the time, you'll still recognize it as I. So you've seen this I before, little lowercase I, but you might also see somebody draw the letter I and put a little heart on top. It doesn't matter though, they're still I. You can catch the distinction between the little dot and the heart, but it doesn't really change how the letter is perceived. It's perceived as I. This one with the heart here is not some different letter. They're the same. Moving forward then, let's talk about sounds. Let's talk about phonology. If we have this sort of deep structure level, it will be the same sort of terminology. Instead of calling it a grapheme, now we're talking about sounds. Let's call it a phoneme. After all, phone means sound. Okay, well, sometimes there are different ways to actually produce the sound in the real world. It's still perceived as the same sound, it's just going to be produced a little bit different. So in English, a fun example people like to give, because it's sort of easy to hear or feel, is the difference between aspiration in the P consonant. So at this level, these are both variations of sort of the deep structure for P. I don't want to write anything in there, but if you want to think about, this the phoneme is dreaming of something, it's dreaming of P. It's not actually realizable in any one particular way, because in English there are different ways to produce the perception of the phoneme P. So same thing, let's call these, instead of allographs, since we're talking about sounds, let's call these allophones. So I'll give you a quick example, and then we'll move on to a more in-depth example. So think of the English word pin and the English word spin. If you put your hand in front of your mouth and you say pin, you're going to feel a burst of air at the very beginning of the word. But if you put your hand in front of your mouth and you say spin, you'll feel some air, but it's not going to be nearly as much. Well, that's because in English, oftentimes word initial stressed syllables are aspirated. So what we do is we produce pin like this, and we produce spin without aspiration, most of the time anyway. Okay? So that's the sort of natural variation of those two. But it's not, the P in pin is not a different P than the P in spin as far as English speakers are concerned. You could produce the P in pin either way. You could produce it with aspiration, or you could produce it without aspiration. It wouldn't really make a difference. In the same way that you could produce the P in spin without aspiration as it is naturally, or with aspiration, it would still be perceived that way. And you can sort of try that. So if you say spin, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but if you say it with aspiration like that, spin, it's still going to be perceived as spin. If you exaggerate it far enough, it might be seen a little different, but at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter. That's because in English, the difference between these two sounds is allophonic. They are allophones. Okay, so let's talk about a little more about how that kind of plays in. Now I want to give you an example with T. Also in English, like I said, oftentimes word initial stressed syllables are aspirated, or well, consonants, word initial consonants and stressed syllables are aspirated. Let's talk about aspirated T and unaspirated T. Just to change it up, I'm going to play you a sort of professionally recorded clip of a linguist playing, or saying rather, aspirated T and unaspirated T. So here is unaspirated T.
Da, ata,
Okay? And here is aspirated T, and this is a good example. Listen for the breathiness, the ta. Listen for that.
ta, ata.
Okay, so that should give you a good difference, a good way to hear the difference between those two. Okay? So in English, we do the same thing as with pin and spin. We can talk about English words. In English, aspiration is what's called allophonic. In other words, you can switch between aspirated and unaspirated P, and it doesn't change the meaning of the word. An English speaker could hear the word till, which has aspiration at the beginning, just like pin did. And they could also hear the word still without aspiration, and it wouldn't really, if you switch them, it wouldn't really change the meaning. So let's just talk about that real quick. If I said till as in the same way that I say, so if you think of, so if you're trying this after you watch the video, think of, say the word till, 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 and you'll feel the aspiration, and then say still, and then try to say still without saying the S part. So try to think the word still, but just leave out the S and say till. And you will be producing this right here. You'll be producing till without aspiration. The same thing you can do in reverse if you want to try. You can produce till, till, and then just put an S at the beginning. Still, still. And I'm exaggerating a little bit, but all the same, it should give you a sense of how the sounds are different. Okay, so that's English. English is allophonic with respect to aspiration. But let's talk about a language that isn't. Hindi is phonemic in aspiration. Or you could say aspiration is phonemic in Hindi. What that means is that if you produced till, like we do in English, with aspiration, it would be a different word than if you produced it the way we were just talking about, saying still without the S. In other words, trying to find a way in English to say an unaspirated T at the beginning of a stressed syllable. In Hindi, that would be a totally different word. And so the difference to them is a big difference, whereas for us, it's no difference at all. If you get an idea of how this works, then you will know how a Japanese speaker feels when they need to learn English. In Japanese, for example, L and R are produced as allophones of each other. So what that means is you could, in a word, you could say, for instance, you could say lead, or you could say red, and they would still be perceived as the same word. Very similar to how in English you could say pin with aspiration, or you could say pin without aspiration. It would be perceived as the same word. That's because in English, aspiration is allophonic. There are plenty of languages where that's not the case, where aspiration is phonemic. It makes the difference between two words. Well, in Japanese, this difference is allophonic. And that's why sometimes Japanese speakers might have a hard time hearing that difference. So if you try to think about that, imagine speaking Hindi as an English speaker, where you might have a difficult time hearing the difference between the aspirated consonant and the unaspirated consonant because you're not a trained listener, you don't have much experience doing it. Whereas Hindi speakers have a ton of experience doing it, they've been doing it from the beginning. Just like we've been hearing the difference between L and R, Hindi speakers have been hearing the difference between aspirated T and unaspirated T. So in any case, hopefully that gives you some help about the concept of an allophone. Feel free to give me an email if you have any other questions.